and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today, let's talk a little bit about Rhipsalis goebeliana. Rhipsalis goebeliana has had a very, very bizarre history. It was described by Backeberg, and I'm going to read the description that was provided in Cactus Lexicon by Kurt Backeberg. So the description says, the body of the plant is bushy and hanging. Primary shoots are narrow, flat, with a robust nerve, 8 millimeters broad above, terate below. It is vivid green. The terminal shoots narrowly oblong, plus or minus tapering above. They are 8 to 13 centimeters long and 2.5 to 3 centimeters broad, sometimes slightly wavy. The flower is pinkish white. The ovary is oblong with scales. The fruit is greenish white, and then it follows with origin ? The reason why this says origin ? is because it's another one of those plants that was found only in cultivation. And so what ended up at this time, let me be clear, at this time it was only found in cultivation. And so what ended up happening is really interesting. So they actually lost, or it was never collected, any kind of original sample of the plant that Backeberg described. So what ends up happening is that years later, I believe in 1995, W. Barthlott and N.P. Taylor published an article in Bradlea. I think that it must have been edition 13, pages 43 to 79. And it basically says it was about a monograph of Rhipsalidae Cactaceae. We find Rhipsalis goebeliana here again. And the information that we find, there are no pictures, by the way. And as a matter of fact, there were no pictures originally in Backeberg's book. I believe that there was some type of a sketch or something, but I have never really been able to find that it was published somewhere else. Here, all that is really being said, there's not really much of a description or anything. Basically, it just says that the original illustration would end up being the lectotype. And so what that means is that a specimen or illustration that was designated at the type when no holotype was indicated at the time of publication. So basically, they were saying that the original sort of drawing that was done of this would end up being the lectotype. And what they ended up doing was designating a neotype for this at this time. And what's interesting about this is that the neotype was actually a plant that was selected from the botanical gardens in Bonn. So the identification for that, or the accession number, is 4467. Kind of an important thing. Also, that plant was only ever really cultivated, so it was only ever found in cultivation. At this time, 1995, we end up with a neotype. It also has this kind of fun description in here of saying that Rhipsalis goebeliana grows in Bolivia. So that's a little bit interesting. So then a little bit later, we end up with another article, Ecology, Biogeography, and Diversity of the Bolivian Epiphytic Cacti, with the description of 2 new taxa. And this was published in Bradlea, I believe, volume 18, pages 2 through 30. The authors of this are P.L. Ibish, M. Kessler, C. Nowicki, and W. Barthlott. It basically says that the distribution range for this is very, very small and is endemic to Bolivia. Distribution in Bolivia, Department of Cochabamba. The species has only been recorded from near Andean and foothill rainforests of the Chapare region, which represents the most humid area of Bolivia. So before we read any of this, we actually have to preface this with the initial statement that the plants that are being described as goebeliana in this article are probably not goebeliana at all. They're actually probably Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis. And, as more information kind of came out, it became obvious that that was probably what was going on. And so the comments in the previous article also saying that Rhipsalis goebeliana was from Bolivia also might not be correct. The only true clone that we know of Rhipsalis goebeliana in existence is the one that was selected as the neotype from the Botanical Garden at Bonn with the accession number 4467. The annual precipitation is up to greater than 5,000 millimeters. The altitude range that it was found growing at was 200 to 750 meters. The flowers are small and white. The fruits, it just says small berries. And the conservation value and status at this time was vulnerable. It has some notes here. It says the history of the discovery and knowledge of this species illustrates that in poorly studied countries like Bolivia, it is still difficult to assess and assess the conservation status of certain plant species. The type collection of this species was lost, and although living collections were held in botanical gardens, the natural distribution remained unknown until recently. That is cited as coming from Barthlott and Taylor, 1995. In the last few years, the species has been found by S. Beck as well to be quite common in the Chapare region, and one might wonder why it has not been collected more regularly. In spite of its relative abundance, the species is threatened by massive habitat destruction currently taking place in the region. That is cited as coming from Henkel, 1995. The restricted range can probably be explained by the species' dependence on per-humid conditions. It is probably most common near rivers and in floodplain forests where high humidity may favor it. Interestingly, it is not found in forests on nutrient-poor white sands. In the vicinity of Villa Tunari, despite otherwise apparently suitable conditions suggesting a dependence on nutrient-rich substrates. Apparently, it is most closely related to Rhipsalis cuneata, which occupies a different altitude belt. Both species have been recorded growing close to each other at 700 to 750 meters elevation near El Palmar in Carrasco National Park, Department of Cochabamba. At the upper limit of its elevation range, Rhipsalis goebeliana somewhat resembles Rhipsalis cuneata morphologically for having broader, thicker segments. If we end up going to the new Cactus Lexicon by David Hunt, and we read the description of Rhipsalis goebeliana there, we end up finding that it is sort of not really listed as a real species at this time. It has this description where it says the body is shrubby, pendant, primary branch is flat, narrow 8 millimeters broad, terate below, bright green, terminal branch segments narrowly oblong, tapered, 8 to 13 centimeters by 2.5 to 3 centimeters, sometimes slightly sinuate. The flower is pinkish white. It flowers in summertime. The pericarpal is oblong, scaly. The fruit is greenish white. And then it goes on to basically say indeterminate. So here it's saying that Backeberg's illustration, his original illustration, resembled Rhipsalis oblonga, but that the name of Rhipsalis goebeliana was also applied to an Andean taxon resembling Rhipsalis macrantha, so it was best to just completely abandon it. We now know that the Andean taxon that was being discussed there by Hunt was actually Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis. This is kind of the interesting thing that happens, and we've seen it happen with a couple of Rhipsalis species. What will happen is something like this will come out and it will basically be like, well, we can't really call that a species. And a really good example of this is Rhipsalis rhombea. So Rhipsalis rhombea sort of lost its species status. And I don't even think it was reduced because I don't even think they knew what to reduce it to. It just sort of was like, well, we can't really, it was poorly described. It's not a species, like, end of story, right? So what ended up happening is that everyone had this plant in our collections. We had what was Rhipsalis rhombea. But because it was like it's no longer a species, what ends up happening is that over time, it actually starts to morph into being called a different species. And it seems like it's something that we do just because we either can't place it because Rhipsalis rhombea is no longer an option. So if it's not Rhipsalis rhombea, what is it? And more often than not, we ended up deciding that Rhipsalis rhombea was Rhipsalis oblonga. So a lot of us have a real species, Rhipsalis rhombea, in our collections that we have labeled Rhipsalis oblonga or bought as Rhipsalis oblonga. I've actually purchased it multiple times as Rhipsalis oblonga, and part of the reason why was because, well, it kind of fit the description, So it was like, well, it has real tiny branch segments, so, they weren't very wide. They had a tendency to be pretty narrow, and they were pretty small, and so it was like, well, even though it doesn't totally fit the description correctly, and even though, I will tell you right now, here's the thing. If you have 2 Rhipsalis in your collection, and they flower, and the flowers do not look even close to the same, they are not the same Rhipsalis species. That is what is true. And that would have been very obvious with the real Rhipsalis oblonga and Rhipsalis rhombea. And so much, much later, Rhipsalis rhombea now has been reinstated as a species, and now we kind of have to undo all of that damage and, get the real Rhipsalis rhombea, back to being known as Rhipsalis rhombea, which I will be doing a video about that in the future. What would have happened here is that Rhipsalis goebeliana would have just disappeared as an option. But we all have this plant in our collections, and so what do we call it? It seems as though what it ended up being called was Rhipsalis occidentalis. And I don't know when, I'm not quite sure how, because there's a gap right here. There's a gap because what's going on is that at the time that a neotype was designated, that was in 1995. We're looking at David Hunt basically saying it's not really a species anymore, I believe in 2006. So somewhere between then and now, it's very clearly regained its species status. It's a recognized species today. So if we go on just a little bit of a journey here, so if we're going to go to basically q.org, so we're going to look at the Royal Botanical Gardens, which sometimes this is wrong, sometimes this is right, sometimes the pictures aren't right here, sometimes they are. It just so happens that the picture of Rhipsalis goebeliana that is here is correct. So a lot of people are probably freaking out right now because they're no, that's Rhipsalis occidentalis. But remember, I think that there are many examples of us sort of losing species and placing them as other species over a long period of time, which I think is probably what happened to Rhipsalis goebeliana. Another really good example of that is essentially what ended up happening to Rhipsalis sulcata. Rhipsalis sulcata having a more green form of Rhipsalis ewaldiana with white berries getting misplaced on a massive scale for Rhipsalis sulcata. And I think, sometimes it happens because the species is super hard to grow or it's super hard to ship, or because it's reduced to something else. So sometimes that just happens and it just sort of disappears. Or in the case with Rhipsalis sulcata, having a large-scale distributor distribute that under an incorrect name so widely for such a long period of time, what ends up happening is that everyone who's just kind of a private collector and they collect it, they don't look for the real Rhipsalis sulcata because they have no reason to. They already have it. I think that that's kind of the issue with Rhipsalis occidentalis. I think that because somehow Rhipsalis goebeliana kind of morphed into being Rhipsalis occidentalis because, well, it wasn't a species anymore, we stopped looking for Rhipsalis occidentalis because we all already had it. Why would we keep looking for it? Although I can tell you this is not Rhipsalis occidentalis. We're going to go, we can basically see this picture here, but I'm going to go and look at rhipsalis.com. So on rhipsalis.com, if we actually go and we look for Rhipsalis goebeliana, here again, we see this picture. This is the same picture from Q, right? And there is one thing that I want to point out about. There's not much more information here than what I've already kind of provided. Usually the text on rhipsalis.com is really good. They usually pull it from, descriptions from different accurate publications. So usually that information is really good. This is what I'm looking for. So notes. Backeberg 1959 described Rhipsalis goebeliana based on a cultivated specimen of unknown provenance. Rhipsalis goebeliana resembles forms of Rhipsalis cuneata and Rhipsalis oblonga. However, the pale, live green stems with serrate, slightly lobed, or dentate margins are sufficient to recognize it as a separate taxon. Furthermore, the recent molecular phylogeny of Rhipsalis, Calvente et al. In Prep, indicates this species is not linked to Rhipsalis cuneata nor to Rhipsalis oblonga. Therefore, to avoid confusion with Brazilian and Andean species, the circumspection here applied only includes the cultivated specimens. So when the phylogenetic studies were done, what ended up happening, and we can kind of get into that a little bit, what ended up happening is that Rhipsalis goebeliana was found to be most closely related to Rhipsalis ewaldiana and to Rhipsalis rhombea. So, Rhipsalis ewaldiana and rhombea were in a sister clade, and then in a further out clade, Rhipsalis goebeliana was found to have evolved from the same species as those two. So that's what's kind of interesting. And when you look at them, you can see that they all kind of share these floral traits. And Rhipsalis ewaldiana and Rhipsalis goebeliana actually share these kind of traits with their clones, where like with Rhipsalis ewaldiana, we see these real vivid bright green clones. Well, you see the same thing with Rhipsalis goebeliana. You can see these really bright green clones, and then you see these kind of darker green clones that can get a little bit reddish, and it's the same kind of thing that you see with Rhipsalis ewaldiana. And even with the berries, you can see same thing with Rhipsalis ewaldiana, those bright green clones. They have berries that start green, ripen to white. The more type clone, which is a lot more kind of pinkish or reddish, it will end up with unripe sort of, I don't know, it's kind of a dirty pinkish or reddish colored berry or whatever. And then as it ripens, it will be pink. And so you actually see the same thing with Rhipsalis goebeliana. You see those bright green clones, they have greenish berries that will ripen to a different color. I believe it's white. And then you have the kind of darker clones that have, hints of a little bit more red. They have the same thing, where they have these kind of darker reddish pinkish kind of berries that will no doubt ripen to be pink. So that's not the most surprising thing, that there might be some color variation there. So that's actually kind of one of the problems with some of these original descriptions. I think describing the colors of these branch segments, they're describing what they saw, but, we know that like putting these plants in higher light, shady conditions, that kind of stuff can have a real impact over an extended period of time of just the overall color, and even to some degree, some of the morphology of the plant. What I want to kind of hit at, though, is the really specific comment that was made here. Lobed, so it says slightly lobed or dentate margins and this would be of the clades, really. And so what I want to go look at really fast here is this idea of what dentate is, what it means. So if we look here, you can see this visual dictionary online. We can see leaf margins, and here we actually see what a dentate margin looks like. And then all the way to the right, we see one that's called lobate. And so what they would be saying is that it was slightly lobed, right? So it just had a little bit of lobing on it. And I think for some of these, whoa, we're going to Pinterest. But here, again, we see this dentate, and you can kind of see what that looks like. And then, we see lobed. Again, we see what that looks like. But bear in mind, it was saying slightly lobed. Kind of want to go back now and just take a look at the plant that we were looking at Q, right? So when we look at Q's plant, what we see is exactly what they're talking about in the description. It is actually the only Rhipsalis that I have seen described this way. It's not the only Rhipsalis that I have seen capable of producing growth like this from time to time, but it is the only one that I think kind of prominently will display growth like this. And you can see exactly what it's talking about. It's talking about that dentate where it like really, really indents in, and then you can see other branches or other clades that are like this, where it has slight lobing to it. And so it has a mixture of that. And you can also see that the plant actually has some, longer growth that is either flat or kind of triangulate like that. So that's essentially what this looks like. And if you're still not convinced, if we look for Rhipsalis goebeliana and we look for pictures of Rhipsalis goebeliana, I'm looking for a specific picture of Rhipsalis goebeliana. This picture. There we go. So this happens to be in a publication that you can get from BioOne, and the publication is the Neotypification of Rhipsalis rhombea, which we talked about rhombea being reinstated, Rhipsalidae, Cactaceae, and its taxonomic history. And what ended up happening here is because they were doing, they did kind of an analysis of Rhipsalis rhombea in the phylogenetic studies, and that's how they ended up finding that like rhombea and ewaldiana and goebeliana were very closely related. Here we see this plant, and what I'm going to say about this plant is very important. The plant in this picture was actually credited as being cultivated at the botanical gardens in Bonn with the accession, I don't know why I can't say that, with the accession number 4467. The reason why that's really important is because this exact plant, the picture of this plant, is actually the plant that was selected as the neotype for Rhipsalis goebeliana. So this is the best representation that we have of Rhipsalis goebeliana, and the most accurate one. Secondly, I'm going to say that the people who actually wrote this article are none other than Ralph Bauer and Nadia Kortakova. Don't know if I'm saying her name right, but both of these people are well-known botanists, right? So they aren't going to basically select and display an incorrect Rhipsalis goebeliana or go find it off the internet somewhere, which we've gone through. Like, I can show you a ton of ways in which that is totally incorrect. But here we can see this is, in fact, Rhipsalis goebeliana. And so once again, you can see that kind of dentate lobing that's on these branch segments. And in some cases, oh my goodness, I'm zoomed in too far and I can't get out. And it's kind of hard to see, but you can see like somewhere down kind of in the lower left-hand corner, you can see, a branch segment there that has, a little bit more where it's slightly lobed. And what's important here as well is the flowers. So you can kind of see the flowers here. You can buy this article from Bio1. So you can definitely just go to Bio1 and pretty much buy the article. I'll put the links in the description for the article and literally all of the things that we talk about today so that you can get them, at least the ones that I can provide links to. And I mean, this is where things get just a little bit goofy, because what ends up happening here is that we could see the picture and everything from Q of Rhipsalis goebeliana. You can actually see sort of in this picture how they're talking about, you know, some of the branches, they'll get a little bit wavy and stuff, and it can kind of take on an ever so slightly different morphology. You know, falling a little bit more on the lobe side, but it's still, its lobing is still generally different. It is still generally slightly lobed. This plant is still bright green, but, you know, as we saw with the other plant, you know, it's not really that kind of bright green. It's more of an actual, like, real green. Now, if we go back here and we actually look for Rhipsalis occidentalis. This is where sometimes I think we can get a little bit suspicious. So this one says that it is now a synonym of Rhipsalis cuneata, and it probably has been or will be reduced to a synonym of Rhipsalis cuneata. But what we're looking at here is very specifically where the distribution is. We're looking at Peru, Ecuador, and Suriname as being the distribution. So it doesn't really have a distribution in Bolivia. These pictures are definitely not pictures of Rhipsalis occidentalis. I don't quite know what those are pictures of. And if we scroll all the way down here, we end up seeing what are very clearly pictures, again, of Rhipsalis goebeliana. So we're seeing pictures of Rhipsalis goebeliana and the Rhipsalis goebeliana flower as being representative of Rhipsalis occidentalis. And I really think that, you know, that must have been what happened to this, because it was reduced, it was no longer there. Everyone just kind of lumped it into Rhipsalis occidentalis, because what else would you do with it? Especially because Rhipsalis occidentalis, it's kind of rare. And I think that the reason why it's so rare is because it's supposed to be really hard to grow. You know, I don't really think that Rhipsalis goebeliana is hard to grow. That's why most of us have it in our collections. But Rhipsalis occidentalis, most of us have probably never seen it. We can kind of take a look real fast, because I happen to find something really cool about Rhipsalis occidentalis here. You know, one of the reasons why this is so difficult, it can be so hard, is because we actually cannot show pictures of these things because of copyright. You know, like here I can use Google and stuff like that to do that, and as long as I'm sort of like crediting the publication, it's not such a big deal, but I can't just outright open copyrighted material and just show that. So here, if we look for Rhipsalis occidentalis, we're going to end up with a whole bunch of Rhipsalis goebeliana, but that is expected. So here, here, you know, we see this being tagged as Rhipsalis occidentalis. We see this beautiful plant with these kind of pinkish flowers, and, you know, you see the branches very clearly. This plant is Rhipsalis goebeliana. One other thing that I want to point out about this, which is really interesting. So Rhipsalis ewaldiana, Rhipsalis rhombea, and Rhipsalis goebeliana, all of these can have this kind of interesting little like pinkish spot or like reddish spot, like right at the center of their flowers, like right down just around the stigma. It's just this little pink mark, and it doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does happen, and all three of them are capable of producing this, if that helps anybody. But, you know, here we can see just this, you know, large flush of these beautiful flowers. I am going to say, like, mine that's like this, that is kind of this darker green one, it produces just the most fantastic, beautiful flowers. It just is really, really beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous plant. But, we'll find a total flood of, basically just like a whole bunch of Rhipsalis goebeliana. And so it's just the same kind of thing that we've seen with a lot of other things. It's very, very difficult to find the actual Rhipsalis occidentalis. But if we try hard enough, we can. So wherever I don't know who this person is, and, I don't know how they got this plant, but they were really awesome in tagging it. Because what they did here was they actually tagged this plant as being collected from Peru with the accession number of 35392. Now, if we take that little number and we go back to rhipsalis.com, this is how nerdy my life can be sometimes, guys. And we actually go look for this number. We will find right there this telling us that specific plant that is in that picture, or the cutting of that specific plant that is in that picture, it is tagged with the accession number of the holotype, meaning that it should be the exact clone that the original description came from. So I also want to say that, because of like copyright and stuff, I can't really show certain things, but what I can do is tell you certain things. So in the new Cactus Lexicon illustrations by David Hunt, Rhipsalis occidentalis is pictured. And one of the cool things is that the picture of this, it basically says that it was from Peru. And I'm not sure if it's saying that Ralph Bauer collected it or it came from his collection or what, but it has something to do with Ralph Bauer. And so the reason why I say that is because the picture that is in the new Cactus Lexicon is not going to be a wrong picture. And so the picture that we are looking at here on Flickr, this really is Rhipsalis occidentalis. And if we zoom way in on these flowers and sort of on, I guess, the ovary of the flower, we can get kind of a little bit of an idea. I realize this is kind of blurry and not ideal, but it gives us kind of an idea. I just want to point out the way that the ovary looks here. Notice how the ovary is just like really round, right? Like it's a whole lot more round. And whereas Rhipsalis goebeliana's ovary is longer, it's kind of like it's just a much more oblong kind of shape than this. Added to that, between these descriptions, Rhipsalis goebeliana's flower is actually sized at between 1 centimeter and 1.5 centimeters in diameter. And my plants that I measured were typically 1.5 centimeters in diameter, although I have seen them a little bit smaller, but not by much. Whereas Rhipsalis occidentalis's flowers were supposed to be somewhere around 0.8 centimeters and 1 centimeter in diameter. So they were considerably smaller. Added to that, there are like descriptions where it talks about Rhipsalis goebeliana's flowers having this kind of like yellow tone to them, which we saw in the pictures. They definitely have kind of a yellow tone. If you put in, highlight, it would end up with more pinkish tints in them. You saw the kind of red center on the flowers. When it comes to Rhipsalis occidentalis, though, you don't really find that in the descriptions. What you find is them always calling out that the flower is white, and then you find it being called out quite often that the petals are transparent or translucent. So you can see that in this picture here. It's got a very, very tiny flower. So even though this isn't the greatest representation, really, of like the overall plant morphology, we get a general idea. I mean, you can definitely see that just on the clades that we're showing here, that there's definitely a different sort of shape to these clades, right? We don't see that dentate shape here. I have seen it like I want to be careful here because I have seen pictures where it can slightly show up very, very rarely from the pictures that I've seen. But more often than not, it is more lobed like this. Here again, this is the same plant, so we're going to go here first. So once again, here we see the same plant. Again, I want to call out that ovary, very round kind of ovary. I think that there was a lot of speculation about Rhipsalis occidentalis possibly being very closely related to Rhipsalis macrantha. And I'm guessing that has a lot to do with, this very round kind of ovary and the flower, because it does look considerably more like a Rhipsalis macrantha flower, actually, especially in these pictures. So here again, if we zoom way in, again, you can see the flower is white. There might be a little tiny bit of pink on the very end of that petal there, but you see, again, it appears to be transparent or translucent looking, and it's very small. So this is the thing. The flowers between these two plants, they're different. They're not the same flower. And as I said at the beginning of the video, when it comes to Rhipsalis, you are not going to have just a completely different flower and have it be the same species. That's not going to happen. And that's not happening here, right? There's Rhipsalis goebeliana, which is Rhipsalis goebeliana, and Rhipsalis occidentalis, which we almost never see. I've spent tons of time researching Rhipsalis all over the place, all over the internet, and I very, very rarely see pictures of this plant. So I think that thing that they say about it being very hard to cultivate is probably pretty true. So here we pop back out. There was another sample that this person had. This again, Rhipsalis occidentalis, this time from Ecuador. Here we actually see these berries on this plant, so we get a general idea of what the berries look like. And again, here we get a really, really nice, good, clear view of what the clades look like on Rhipsalis occidentalis. And we can see that there is a distinct difference between these clades and the clades of Rhipsalis goebeliana. So here's, this one was tagged differently as well. So this one was tagged as coming from Ecuador, which is a place where Rhipsalis occidentalis grows. What is the name of that place? Okay, so this is a really good example of something like this happening. So this is Tropiflora, which, bless them, they sell some really, really amazing plants, but the labeling's not always correct. But here, one of the kind of messed up issues is that this is a place in the United States where a lot of people were buying Rhipsalis from. They are in Florida, so you can physically go buy plants if you're in that area. But sometimes, if you just sort of hang out on the internet, you can buy plants from them. But this particular plant, which if we go through the pictures here, this particular plant, unfortunately, it ended up getting distributed as Rhipsalis AFF goebeliana. And so what it was saying was it has an affinity to goebeliana. But part of the problem with this is that I think that people bought this and then dropped the AFF off of this. And then what ended up happening is that mass distribution ended up with this plant being known in cultivation as Rhipsalis goebeliana. And so once again, you get a lot of confusion happens, right? And so this plant ends up being really confused, and everyone thinks that this plant is Rhipsalis goebeliana because it's being distributed by a reputable source. So it has to be Rhipsalis goebeliana, right? And then the real Rhipsalis goebeliana ends up being distributed all over the place as Rhipsalis occidentalis because, well, it has nowhere else to go, right? So it's just kind of a mess. It's very, very confusing. And at one time, this plant was being sold as agudoensis. I believe Tropiflora also had sold it under the name agudoensis before they changed it to this Rhipsalis affinity goebeliana. So it's not Rhipsalis goebeliana. Don't drop abbreviations off, even if you buy them from someplace. If you ever bought plants from a place like this and it had the abbreviations on, put the abbreviations back. We can look at this publication in 2011, the American Journal of Botany. It looks like it, I don't know, is volume number 98 or something. It's kind of hard to figure out what that is. But this can be found on this bsapubs.onlinelibrary.wiley.com. And so basically it's saying, what does it take to resolve relationships and to identify species with the molecular markers? An example from the Epiphytic Rhipsalidae Cactaceae. And you can see that Nadia Kortkova is one of the authors of this. And we can see that Wilhelm Barthlott also helped with this. There's Nigel P. Taylor, so N.P. Taylor, Thomas Borsch, Dietmar Quandt, Kai F. Mueller. So a lot of big names that are in there, that helped with this. So this is a pretty sciencey read if you want to read it. There's just a few tiny interesting things here that we can look at. One is just kind of, if you go through and you look at sort of like these phylogenetic trees that are going on in these, gives you kind of an idea of like where things are placed, how they're related. Here we can see Rhipsalis goebeliana and Rhipsalis ewaldiana. You can see that they were actually in a clade there, in a sister clade together. And then you can see Rhipsalis cuneata and Rhipsalis occidentalis are in a sister clade together. And so I don't think that we ever totally got to this. So you can purchase magazines from the society Epig. So Epig is in Germany, and one of the magazines, it is volume number 62, which was published in 2008, has this absolutely massively interesting article. Now, the articles, there is kind of a synopsis of this article in English, but the rest of the article, like the large article, is written in German, so you will need to sort of translate it. I just take pictures of it and then pass it through Google Translate to figure that out. So one of the articles here is by Ralph Bauer, which, like I said, very prominent botanist, wrote an article that is called Rhipsalis cuneata, Britain and Rose, a variable species with flat stems from the eastern slopes of the Andes of Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. Description of the new subspecies, Rhipsalis cuneata, subspecies australis. So it's an extremely interesting sort of read. But one of the things that he says in here, which Rhipsalis.com kind of quotes it, about Rhipsalis occidentalis being reduced to Rhipsalis cuneata. So that's a real possibility that it either already has happened or will happen. And if you purchase this, I will say you won't be sorry. It's a really fascinating read, and there are actually tons of pictures of Rhipsalis cuneata, Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis, and Rhipsalis goebeliana. So tons of pictures, great descriptions, great article. And so once again, you can purchase these from Epig. If you go to their website, which we can go there right now and kind of look at this. So I know that I direct people there all the time, and I'm just like, go to Epig. But for some people, it can be difficult if you're in a different country, because you'll go to this website and you will be terrified because obviously this is in German. So if you don't speak or read German, this will be difficult. However, in your browser, you can click on that little double A thing in the corner there and translate the website to English. And like magic, this whole website is in English. Great place. They have tons of pictures. There are wonderful image galleries on here. Come here all the time and look at them. I have kind of like a weird problem with that. You can become a member of Epic. It's really, really great. There you can see the Epic magazine. You can see index files. So you can see pretty much, I don't know, this is kind of changed, but you can see listings of all of these. Okay. So I think that I can't read this, but I think that what's being said here is that is actually the volume. And then that is the year, I think. So if we were looking for volume 62, I think we have to go down. There we go. So volume 62, there it is. Boom. I found it. So there's the actual article. But if you wanted these, you can become a member there by writing to Kirsten. I think that what you have to do, I don't think it says this anymore, but you can try it. You can actually send an email here to Miss Kirsten Pfeiffer and inquire about specifically purchasing one specific magazine. So if you were really, really super interested in reading more about, Rhipsalis cuneata, Occidentalis goebeliana, and the new subspecies of cuneata, you can request, like I said, it is number 62, and it was published in 2008. Super fascinating read. But that's also just Epic and, kind of how you can get around the website, because I realize that I talk about it all the time, but I don't think I've ever actually shown it. So coming back here to this lovely place, I think that what I wanted to point out about that was the idea that they were so closely related in the phylogenetic charts, right? So cuneata and Occidentalis, and knowing here that goebeliana, the plant that was actually sampled, was the neotype plant that came from the botanical gardens in Bonn. And because you know full well that Rhipsalis goebeliana and Rhipsalis occidentalis are not the same plant. And even just because of this, you would know that Rhipsalis goebeliana and Rhipsalis ewaldiana probably have flowers that are a little more similar to each other. And, that's pretty far away from cuneata, but cuneata and Occidentalis would have had flowers that were considerably similar to each other. So the pictures that we looked at of Occidentalis, those little tiny flowers with like the very round ovaries, is also very reminiscent of what Rhipsalis cuneata actually looks like in terms of flowers. And so because it's very likely that Rhipsalis cuneata and Rhipsalis occidentalis are actually the same plant species, it's just kind of pretty likely that they have the same flower. Their flowers are really not going to be any different. So that's just something kind of important about that. I just was not right about that. I actually thought the picture was in there, but I forgot that it was actually in Nadia Kortkova's dissertation. So let's go to her dissertation. You can get this from this place. I will put it in the link. I don't know how I find these things. I just find these things. But in any case, her dissertation was about phylogeny and the evolution of epiphytic Rhipsalidae cactaceae. You can see that this was published in 2011. It only looks like it's in German. So I'm in the United States and I would have a very tough time if this was in German, but you can see that it goes on to actually be in English for people who were like, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here and you can read this. I mean, all of this is very fascinating reads, very, very cool to read. But what we are after here is specifically this lovely little thing. Because, like I said before, because sometimes Some plants are so difficult to find accurate pictures of just because they've just vanished. I remember trying to find pictures of Rhipsalis sulcata, and it was like you just could not find them. There were so few of them. And the same thing is true for Rhipsalis occidentalis. But we can come here to something like this where we see Rhipsalis occidentalis pictured in J here. We can see in the footnote there that it's telling us, and we can just zoom in here. And you can see that this actually looks very close, very close to the picture that we looked at that was on Flickr, right? So here again, you see these white berries. You can see the pretty lobing on those branches. From the pictures that I've seen of Rhipsalis cuneata, it definitely kind of looks similar. I have a little cutting of Rhipsalis cuneata. Actually, I have a few plants labeled Rhipsalis cuneata. And I can tell you right now, I am waiting until every single last one of those plants bloom before I decide what any of them are, because I don't trust anything. I don't trust my eyes. I feel like one of the bad things that happens is that when we look at pictures like this, our brains, they just make stuff up, right? So when we look at pictures like this, our brain fills in a whole bunch of things and it tries to tell us ideas of how big or how small this is, but there's no reference. So our brain just sort of decides whatever, right? And in reality, this could be very small. This could have super small clades. It could have super big clades. We kind of don't really know from these pictures. We could make a guess, we could measure the berries and sort of try to figure that out from that. But it's one of the things that I find super difficult about pictures like this. And especially when it came to the flat clade Rhipsalis, I found them all very difficult to distinguish based off their clades, especially because some of them, when we look at Rhipsalis goebeliana's clades, we see some that have those very dentate branch segments, but then we see some that have slightly lobes. So what we're seeing is two very distinct kind of clade shapes, and a lot of them have that. Some of them have more than two distinct clade shapes. You see that same kind of thing on Rhipsalis rhombea. So it can be real confusing sometimes when you only see a small little piece of a plant like that. It's just kind of complicated. But one thing that's not complicated is that very clearly does not look anything like any of the Rhipsalis goebeliana plants that we've looked at. And the other thing that is very distinct is that the flowers are clearly not the same. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed kind of taking a deep dive into Rhipsalis goebeliana, although I realized that was kind of confusing because we had to look at a lot of things to prove that Rhipsalis goebeliana is Rhipsalis goebeliana. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.